Hello everybody. Today we're going to have a lecture here on the introduction by Robert W. McChesney in the first chapter of Noam Chomsky's book here, which is one of the books that we have for the course Profit Over People. Obviously at this point you have already read through the intro and the first chapter here, so that's going to be the basis of our discussion. One thing I should kind of mention, I guess, early on is this is probably a little bit different than, say, one of the last lectures or the last lecture that we had, George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, because there seems to be a lot more, the writing is of a different purpose, of a different kind of genre. In Shooting an Elephant, there was room for much more kind of metaphorical and symbolic interpretation of what the author was presenting to us. As you can tell, Profit Over People is very much straight to the point. So as far as what I'll be doing with this lecture, it'll probably be just reiterating, emphasizing, highlighting some key points that Chomsky presents to us, and then perhaps tying it into what we're seeing in the current day and age, right? Well, especially with the election season going on and some of the issues that he mentions here. Of course, this book was published in 2011. Some of these issues are incredibly relevant to political platforms that are going on, the conversations that are taking place also as we have these different campaigns going on. So by and large, that's what I'll be doing here in this lecture. Also, if you don't know, I happen to listen to a lot of Chomsky. You know, he's got a ton of speeches online if you're curious. He's got other books out there. His newest book, Who Rules the World, I think just got released, and it's sitting on my bookshelf, but I can't tell you when I'm going to get to it. But one thing you should know about Chomsky is he's a professor at MIT, but he's not a professor in the teaching sense. He doesn't teach these days. He kind of holds himself up in a room and does a heck of a lot of research, right? Whereas a lot of normal people get their news from media, television, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the New York Times, etc., Chomsky takes it upon himself to do much more elaborate investigation of multiple news sources, and then essentially kind of puts them all together, finds a balance, and presents his findings, and tends to be the job that he does. And you get that here in Profit Over People. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Discussing the intro, and like any good introduction, it's going to define and kind of set up for us what Chomsky is going to take further. And that is what Robert W. McChesney does for us. He starts off, if you look at page 7, and I will be reading some direct excerpts from the text as needed, but what I've done here is I've compiled some lecture notes, so other stuff I can kind of just go over more quickly or just make a couple points and kind of move on. But I think it's worth noting right on page 7, right in the beginning of all this, McChesney mentions the irony and the kind of paradox, which is a contradiction of ideas that rings true upon further analysis and investigation. The idea that even though neoliberalism, and we'll be talking a lot about neoliberalism within the kind of economic framework of nations, and also as it finds its way into education, which is kind of what we look into in the next unit, the next module. It's the paradox that even though neoliberalism is the economic code of many superpowers, including the United States, throughout the world, we simply don't talk about it. Some people, myself included, within the last, let's say 2-3 years, didn't even know what it was. And then you find that you have to take it upon yourself to find out what this stuff is, and hopefully reading a book like this starts to make you aware. I think a lot of what we can say about what we're doing here is awareness, 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 so that we can move forward with this information and apply it as need be. So he does make the point, even though neoliberalism is a massively important kind of economic code that is being has its kind of grip on the world, especially with some of these super important nations like the United States. We simply don't talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, you're not considering whether or not it's working for various groups of people, right? That seems to be a good tactic. Don't talk about it. Don't be critical over it, right? Don't say, question it. Don't say negative things toward it. And therefore, it stays in place and just keeps on going, right? Another thing, when you do start to recognize what neoliberalism is, the free market, right? When we talk about neoliberalism, we're talking by and large about the free market, right? Competition, right? Corporations should not be restricted in any sense of the word, so that we can bring jobs to the many and find all kinds of success. One thing that McChesney mentions here early on is that neoliberalism, especially when you identify it and you get into it, it has a very positive aura around it, right? Much the same as capitalism here in America has a very positive aura around it. And if I, say hypothetically, were to speak out against capitalism and perhaps point to some alternatives, or even just be critical of capitalism in the first place, what would be the result of that? Well, people would probably have, kind of look at me and say, what's wrong with you, right? How could you even think about something different than capitalism, because it has such a strong hold on the psychology of Americans and other countrymen from other countries throughout the world. So a very positive aura around it. So positive that we don't even think about alternatives to neoliberalism or some of these other economic frameworks that have been in place for hundreds of years. Moving on here, I just mentioned this and I'll just reiterate. When we talk about neoliberalism, we're talking about the free market, right? That corporations have access to markets around the world, that they aren't restricted, and this leads to prosperity for, ideally, all, right? Working class people, even people in poverty. Of course, Chomsky is going to have some different things to say about that it's actually having very negative effects on massive populations throughout the world, and it's very much just a small group of people who are benefiting from neoliberalism and the free market system, right? On page 8, and I will read these very quickly, McChesney starts to mention some of the results of neoliberalism, and I'll just read the paragraph on page 8 toward the top. The economic consequences of these policies have been the same just about everywhere, and exactly what one would expect. And then he gets into it. A massive increase in social and economic inequality, a marked increase in severe deprivation for the poorest nations and peoples of the world, a disastrous global environment, an unstable global economy, and an unprecedented bonanza for the wealthy. Confronted with these facts, defenders of the neoliberal order claim that the spoils of the good life will invariably spread to the broad mass of the population as long as the neoliberal policies that exasperated these problems are not interfered with. So we're recognizing the extreme socioeconomic inequality that these neoliberal policies are leading to. I think if you do your investigation, and even if you tune in and listen to what a lot of some of these political candidates have been talking about recently, I think we can find some agreement that there is massive socioeconomic inequality. Eventually, I'm not sure where it matches up with this lecture here, you will be watching the video that talks about the extreme wealth gap in the United States. And one thing to keep in mind is that's a trend that is happening globally, right? That we just don't have this extreme wealth gap. We talk about the 1% versus the 99%. or the 2% versus the 98%. This is not just a trend that's occurring in the United States. This is a trend that's actually occurring globally. The rich are getting richer all over the world as the poor are getting poorer, and these middle class segments of societies are diminishing, right? Becoming kind of a smaller group of people. The other thing he mentions in that paragraph is this idea, whether proven or not, right? And Chomsky will say it's not proven, it's actually disastrous. But they mention the idea that the proponents, or the people who believe in or advocate for these neoliberalistic policies, they claim that if the rich get richer and have all this economic success and gain and profit, that will trickle on down to the middle class and the lower class, right? That surely would all kind of trickle down and everybody will share in that success, which Chomsky and McChesney here, of course, writing this intro, disagrees with. That actually it's not having that effect. When does neoliberalism, this is on page 9, the point is making, I don't need to read anything here, but when does neoliberalism work best? When does it procure and secure profits for the global elites? When does it work the best for them? When people do not participate in their democracies. And therefore, there is a steady push and effort on behalf of these massive corporations and the power and influence they have. There is a massive effort to keep people from meaningfully participating in democracy and having a say for themselves, in trying to push for policies that better support them than these corporations. So I think it's, yes, these are all debatable. Everything we read is debatable, right? But you could say, a lot of this seems quite harsh and even sinister when you think about corporations using international, global corporations. We're talking about billion-dollar corporations, keeping people, with all their efforts, keeping people from being a meaningful part of their democracies. But according to Chomsky, at least here in the research that he does, it is happening, right? They are trying to restrict people from participating in democracy. Okay, let's see here. This is important. You find this on page 9, and this idea has been around for a while. It's nothing new, even as this book is published in 2011. Just checking, we're going to be splitting this lecture, just so you know, into 2 parts. We're going to deal with the intro, set ourselves up, and then I'll stop the video, and then we'll have a part 2, which deals with chapter 1. Neoliberalism and global order, right? So we'll split it up here. This is an important point. You'll find it on page 9. What is allowed? We all understand. I mean, look, I can speak my mind. I can walk up to my neighbor and have a debate on a particular issue. I can get on social media and start talking about some important issues. I can tune into the news, and I'm very aware that people are debating and speaking about controversial issues and stuff that they have different opinions. It's happening. It's happening all around me. People are debating. They're disagreeing. That's a democracy. Well, according to Chomsky and McChesney here in the beginning, it is important to keep in mind that the system allows for debate. It allows for debate. However, it only allows for debate on what we call marginal issues, or as stated here, minor issues, right? Republicans and Democrats love to dispute marginal issues. Now, keep in mind, when we say marginal, we don't mean unimportant. What we mean is these are issues that do not necessarily affect the vast amounts of populations in this country or around the world, right? One of the big debates they tend to be marginal issues, and the debates around them, what you see on the news, tends to be around social issues, right? Gay rights is technically a marginal issue, but what that means is it's only affecting a certain percentage, and perhaps not even that large of a percentage of the population, right? Another one is gun rights, which definitely leads to a lot of friction amongst Republicans and Democrats. But again, by and large, technically, it's a marginal issue that really riles people up and gets them divided. And the important thing here is it keeps them from even bigger issues, right? So marginal issues tend to be on social issues. We can debate those all day long. We're encouraged to debate those all along because it keeps us from talking about socioeconomic issues and the real agenda of these advocates and proponents of neoliberalistic policies, right? Yeah, talk about that stuff all day long, but please don't. And we will do everything in our power for you not to talk about the stuff that disrupts the real power that we have here, right? Okay, moving on here. Now, this big idea, which I'm about to mention, will be kind of perpetuated and kind of repeated throughout Chomsky's book here, which is that word free. Don't we love the semantics of that word free? We love the feeling of that word free, right? You get, buy 3, get 1 free. Oh, free, that's fantastic. So we got this term free market, right? And this is what neoliberalism essentially pushes throughout the world, including its own, including the countries, its own country, I guess you could say, like the United States. Free market. But ironically, paradoxically, we realize that a free market does not necessarily mean a free people, right? They contradict one another. They are not compatible. And we'll get more into this. Chomsky definitely deals with this in the next chapter. Talking about populations at large again, an important, and this is mentioned on page 10, an important byproduct of neoliberalistic policy as far as its effects on populations, especially populations that perhaps try to get involved in the democratic process, try to participate in a democracy, is they become depoliticized and filled with cynicism. Personally, right, I'm tuning into the elections, and we got Trump and we got Hillary Clinton, we had a little bit of Sanders, you got a couple other candidates out there as well, but who seems to be the prominent people in this campaign? Well, in this election, it's Clinton and Trump, right? And a lot of people, some aren't, some are turned off by these candidates for various reasons. And of course, that's different for everybody. But I can personally see the cynicism that comes, that is building in people as they realize that this is what their options are. You might have heard a lot of people as this campaign season goes on talking about, well, this person is the lesser of 2 evils, right? And that's a very cynical way of thinking about the leaders that you want to lead your country. That instead of, I'm really enthusiastic and optimistic about this person and this is going to be fantastic, to say, well, they're not as bad as the other person, so be it, right? There is a kind of cynicism that builds, and according to Chomsky here and McChesney as he starts this off, that's actually a desired effect of advocates of neoliberalism, right? These massive corporations. If I can make you want to tune out of your participation in a democracy, then that's going to make the power and control that I maintain that much easier, right? Okay, little point, not to dwell on it, and we'll move right along here. McChesney even mentions maybe this is more like communism than you might think. And I can go into some detail here very quickly. we have Republicans and we have Democrats, right? What we have here is what we call, and we've had it for a long time, a bi-party system. We have two parties that comprise the major political parties of this country. There's a couple others, and again, they're starting to get a little bit of recognition here because of the cynicism and dismay of the American public. You have the Green Party, led by Jill Stein, and then we have Gary Johnson, who is on the Libertarian ticket. So you have far left with Jill Stein, and the Green Party, and you have far right with Gary Johnson and the Libertarian Party. And in the middle, as you start to kind of smush your way into the middle here, come into the middle, you have Democrats and you have Republicans. But notice that they're much closer to the center than these other voices that we have. Chomsky, and he mentions this idea continuously in this book and just kind of generally. He says what we really have here is one party, the Democrats and the Republicans, and what they are when you put them together is the business party, right? Whether you vote Republican or Democrat, it is the corporations, especially the massive corporations, the international corporations, that benefit from whatever policies these two parties stand for, right? Remember, Democrats, Republicans, you can debate the marginal issues all day long. It's a democracy. Go for it. But what Chomsky is mentioning here is that on big issues, socioeconomic issues, trade agreements, etc., they have the same policies in place, which is kind of like communism. Communism is a one-party state. And you could argue, debatable of course, you could argue that Democrats and Republicans are really just one party, it's the business party, and truly what we're dealing with here is, perhaps more than we'd like to believe, a communistic state, right? Communism. Another important issue, and he brings it up here, McChesney, is that corporations outspend labor and campaign funding 10 to 1. When we talk about labor, we're talking about labor unions. We're talking about organizations that work on behalf of labor rights, right? Unions being a major part of that. It is important to note that when it comes to campaign spending, and we've seen a lot of campaign spending, it gets more and more every year. Corporations are outspending labor organizations 10 to 1. That's a massive disparity, right? And obviously, it's hard to keep up with that kind of money being spent on behalf of these corporations. A very cynical way of looking at it, but this is what McChesney mentions. We can't think of these corporations who are giving all of this money to campaigns, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, because both get a lot of money from these corporations. We can't think of them as contributions. You have to be more critical, perhaps even more cynical, and you have to recognize them for what they are, which he says are investments, right? If I give several thousand or more millions of dollars to a particular political candidate, I'm not just being nice and contributing. It's an investment because I expect return on my investment, right? And then we go back to that ratio of corporations outspending labor 10 to 1. They are making a lot more investments in these politicians, and of course, favors, right? These really become, they become expectant of favors in the long run. Sorry about that, had a little interruption. Do apologize. So just kind of picking up on the last point, we were talking about Citizens United. Citizens United is a law that allows for, I think, undisclosed, meaning the amounts are even kind of kept secret, I should say. You don't have to disclose the information. And anonymously, where corporations can start to contribute to campaigns. And this is what's allowing for more and more money to be spent, and we're really talking about millions and millions of dollars to be spent within these campaigns. And the more money that comes into these campaigns, as the argument goes, then the less of a voice the American people have, as they cannot give that kind of money to these campaigns, right? It's all coming from corporate interests. So a very real kind of law out there, Citizens United. Like I mentioned, there is a grassroots effort to try to overturn Citizens United, to limit the corporate spending that's taking place in these campaigns. Moving right along here, just to mention as a side note, it was interesting, and you might have kind of seen this where, you know, it was Bernie Sanders who was not accepting corporate funding or investments, as we can maybe call them here. Instead, he was accepting, you know, small donations from individual Americans, and it really was. And Chomsky, I think, even had recognized this in some interviews that he did. It's unprecedented. It's never happened before, where a campaign, a political candidate is entirely being funded by individual Americans, right? So it was very different than the norm. As far as I know, Obama in 2008, when he ran against McCain, you go back to, you know, going back in time to that campaign, that election season, Obama was accepting unprecedented amounts of money from banks and other corporations in that time, and that was, nobody knew it. If you knew it, if you were looking into it, but if all you did was tune into the news and kind of kept this kind of surface level awareness, like myself, you had no idea he was accepting unprecedented money, unprecedented amounts of money from these corporations. It was it's pretty amazing to think about. We'll talk more about this, I would imagine, the next point here, when we talk about neoliberalism in education. But the whole goal of neoliberalism is to make you more of, condition you to be more of a consumer than a citizen. And what do we mean by citizen? What does it mean to be a citizen? I think for the purposes here, what it means to be a citizen is to be an active participant in a democracy, right? To get involved in a critical and meaningful way, whether it be through protests or whether it be through kind of dialogue within your communities, whatever it is. Neoliberalism would rather, the process of neoliberalism would rather have you be a consumer. Just be good at buying things. Just recognize who you are as a consumer and forget about the citizen. Because as soon as you recognize yourself as a citizen, then you are critical of what's going on. You are questioning what's going on and you want to get involved. There's a real awareness there, right? So just turn people into consumers, and that's it. On page 11, and this is quoted, participation. Neoliberalism is the enemy, quote unquote, the enemy of genuine participatory democracy, right? Chomsky, this is him citing Chomsky. Chomsky even mentions that trouble saying that word, participatory democracy, one that encourages wholeheartedly the participation of individuals within this democracy, is actually incompatible with capitalism, right? They don't go together, right? They are incompatible. Just a few more points and we'll end this first part, and I'll do my best to splice together these videos since I had an interruption, which I do apologize. This point was already mentioned, but I think on page 12 it's worth mentioning again. Free markets, despite that wonderfully sounding word free, are ironically almost never competitive. And he gets into that in the next chapter that we'll be covering here. They fix government, these corporations work to fix government funding, to kind of funnel money into their interests. They encourage the government to protect their markets from competition. A free market is supposed to be about competition, right? Let the competition arise so that, you know, consumers are winning out in many different ways. But believe it or not, the free market actually restricts competition, and we'll see how that kind of works. And also, lastly, a free market actually prevents government from supporting interests of poor and working class, and that was mentioned on page 13 of the introduction, right? Moving on, when you think about globalization, I believe it's Chomsky who mentioned this, I'm almost certain, it's a pseudonym. I mean, it's another way of saying neo-colonialism, right? A new form of colonialism that is still having a major impact around the world. It's it's always interesting to realize the importance of semantics, or what we call things, right? Globalization sounds awesome. The world's coming together, you know, or, you know, I can buy something from a different country and have it in a few days, or if I'm a business, even a small business owner, I can start to sell my products beyond these borders. What a fantastic thing. Globalization is awesome. However, when you think of it in terms of colonialism and taking advantage of other parts of the world, especially for an elite few, then maybe your opinions may change. We were talking about, if you tune into some of the debates right now, TPP, TAP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership. These things are in the news right now, and these are gigantic trade deals that some people argue are only to support the international global corporations, and they will have, as we've mentioned, negative effects on working class people, middle class people, and of course the poor as well. We'll end with just a reiteration for the introduction, and then we'll stop the video, and then I can pick up lecture 2 right after that. We end with a reiteration of the idea that when you think about culturally, there are no alternatives to neoliberalism. There are no alternatives to the free market, right? Any discussion about alternatives to free trade and globalization are off limits, and you could even say blasphemous, right? If I mention anything, if I even try to discuss alternatives to these major economic kind of codes or systems, there's a lot of blowback, there's a lot of retaliation, right? People are going to really have a lot of negative and harsh things to say against me. It is essentially the status quo, and as we know, it is hard to change or question the status quo. However, McChesney here mentions if we never question it, if we never seek out alternatives, things will only get worse, especially once you recognize the problems highlighted by Chomsky throughout this entire book. So if we don't start thinking about alternatives now, then good luck, right? And one more thing, I was watching, I don't know what the organization was called, but there was a meeting, and there was a speech given by President Obama, the President of Mexico, and the President of Canada. And they were all on stage together, and they were essentially talking about kind of the relationship these three countries have here on the, you know, the North American and South American continents, the economic relationship that they have, and, you know, trade and all these things. And, you know, I found it interesting, and I'm very critical, I'll be honest, I'm very critical of a lot of this. But one thing I did recognize is Obama was saying, you know, he was talking about globalization, and he was saying, matter-of-factly, right, as if to declare a status quo, he was saying, yeah, globalization, it's here, it's happening. There's no stopping it. And it's a kind of rhetoric that makes it seem hopeless, again, as we just mentioned, for change or for alternatives, right? That we're kind of in it knee deep, and we have to deal with it, and it's only going to become more and more of a certainty in the world and the way it operates. Globalization, but when you recognize, as Chomsky does, that globalization is in large part neocolonialism, so we have this new wave of colonialism that is spreading throughout the world, and guess what? This is just the way that it is, right? Okay, so we'll end this lecture here. That was dealing with the intro, and of course we'll pick up in just a little bit the next lecture, which is going to be on chapter 1 here, Neoliberalism and Global Order. Thank you.